Miss Marple and the Puzzle of the Merchant's Seal. A Miss Marple story. What hidden truth lies behind an ancient trader's seal? Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I'm your host, Michael. Where are you listening from? Let's fill the comments with curious minds. So glad you're here. Let's begin. The chrysanthemums were late that year. It was the sort of detail that might seem inconsequential to most, but in the village of Little Welford, where a ruffled bloom and a well-pruned hedge could inspire both admiration and enmity. The delay of the season's prize flowers was spoken of with no small degree of anxiety. The annual garden club's autumn fete had arrived nonetheless, proceeding with all the pomp and pride that a village of 300 souls could muster. In the vicarage garden, trestle tables creaked under the weight of sponge cakes, homemade jams, and an alarmingly large collection of beetroot chutney. There was bunting, naturally, in faded red and navy stripes fluttering from one pear tree to the next. Children dashed about underfoot, elderly women supervised them with a watchful eye, and several men in mismatched blazers gathered in conspiratorial groups near the raffle stand, discussing cricket, the rise in seed prices, and the arrival of a new family at Grange House. Miss Marple, neat as a pin in her dove-grey cardigan, and a blue felt hat trimmed with gross-grain ribbon, sat quietly beneath a striped parasol, pretending to knit. Her needles barely moved. "Late blooms and too much beetroot," observed Mr. Enderby, the club's chairman, adjusting his spectacles with a sigh. "I don't suppose the new entrants will salvage this year's display." He gestured toward the horticultural tent, where a modest crowd had begun to assemble. Miss Marple nodded politely, her eyes not on the flowers, but rather on the woman who had just stepped out from behind the cake, still elegant, strikingly composed, and out of place in Little Welford as a swan among ducks. That was Mrs. Honoria Blandford. She had taken the Grange only 3 weeks prior, bringing with her a young maid, an older manservant with a stooped back, and a reputation for wealth, discretion, and widowhood. No one knew much, but everyone had heard something. Shipping fortune, whispered some. Portuguese diamonds, claimed others. Exiled nobility, offered Mrs. Tattlebury, who based this declaration entirely on the woman's matching luggage set and faint accent. The fete buzzed quietly as Honoria crossed the lawn. Her presence was like a drop of ink in milk, disruptive in its elegance. She paused at the table displaying antique trade artifacts contributed by the Historical Society. Among the rusted navigational tools and brittle merchant ledgers, one object stood apart, a heavy brass seal engraved with a curious symbol, part trident, part fishhook, part something older and darker still. "It's a merchant's seal from the early 1700s, said the local schoolmaster, Mr. Price, eager to inform. "It was dredged from the riverbank by a retired tinsmith in Dartford," said a voice behind him, firm and oddly intimate. Honoria turned slowly. A tall, hawk-eyed man had approached, trim suit, olive complexion, and a moustache so immaculately waxed it seemed to point due north and south simultaneously. "Mr. Calvetti," she said. Her tone was smooth, but her knuckles whitened around the handle of her reticule. Several heads turned. No one in Little Welford had seen him before. "I thought you preferred Florence," she added. "And I thought you didn't care for fêtes," he returned. There was a charged silence between them, the kind that wraps around a conversation and squeezes until the air thins. Then, as quickly as he had arrived, the man gave a shallow bow and drifted off toward the croquet pitch. Miss Marple, without looking up, clicked her needles once and resumed her sockled knitting. The fête reached its peak in the late afternoon, with prizes handed out in modest envelopes and sun-warmed lemonade flowing generously. By 5 o'clock, the crowd had begun to thin, and Mr. Enderby declared the fête a success, if only by virtue of the weather holding. It was at precisely 5:30 that young Timothy Larch, an over-enthusiastic member of the Historical Society, came dashing back from the tent with a face as pale as milk pudding. "The seal's gone," he cried, holding up the empty velvet box. Vanished. A flutter of panic stirred. The older women clucked. The younger men looked vaguely interested. But Miss Marple's expression remained too calm. And then came the real horror. Not an hour later, Honoria Blandford was found dead and collapsed behind the rhododendron hedge near the rose competition display. The first whispers said heat stroke. The second murmurs suggested poison. By the time the police were called, someone had already muttered the word murder. Miss Marple gently folded her knitting, tucked it into her bag, and rose with the delicate grace of one who had seen more than she was meant to. She walked quietly toward the hedge, unnoticed by the crowd. Behind her, the fete continued in awkward silence, the scent of bruised roses drifting on the wind. It was the sort of tragedy that rippled through a place like Little Welford, not in thunderclaps, but in whispers, slow and breathy, like wind through barley. By Sunday morning, the village had become a humming hive of speculation, bristling with grief, fascination, and more than a touch of theatrical self-importance. Mrs. Tattleberry, who had appointed herself the unofficial custodian of village decency sometime in 1932, had already composed a handwritten notice for the church bulletin and was consulting with the vicar on whether a moment of silence would be appropriate, tasteful, or excessive. She was a widow, you know, she declared solemnly to the postmistress, who had paused mid-sort to listen. From Portugal or Spain or one of those countries with heat and tile work. She carried herself like nobility, but there was always something too polished. Heat stroke, they say, murmured the postmistress, uncertainly. That's what they said about poor Lionel Witherspoon after that cricket match, replied Mrs. Tattleberry, arching an eyebrow. But he didn't fall behind a rhododendron, clutching his handbag and looking like he'd seen the devil himself. Word of the missing brass seal had reached nearly everyone, though accounts of its importance varied wildly. In the snug of the Stag and Lark, over pints and sandwiches, the men debated whether the object was valuable, cursed, or neither. I heard it had a secret compartment, said Ned Hawkins, a local builder. Filled with old gold coins, maybe. Rubbish, countered Mr. Price, the schoolmaster, who took pride in correcting village folklore. It was a historical trinket, nothing more. From the time of the Hanseatic League, possibly. A collector's oddity. Sentimental value at best. Still went missing, though, Ned said with a shrug. On the same day, a woman drops dead. A bit of a coincidence, if you ask me. Over at the greengrocer's, Mrs. Larch, Timothy's mother, was having a great deal of trouble keeping her son from bursting into tears every time someone mentioned the fate. He only stepped away for a moment, she explained to Mrs. Clifton, the butcher's wife, while placing apples in a paper sack. He'd been tending that table all afternoon. Wasn't even interested in the croquet. And now everyone's acting like he left the crown jewels unguarded. Mrs. Clifton made a sympathetic sound, but her eyes flicked around to ensure others were listening. I heard the dead woman argue with someone just an hour before. Foreign man, one of those intense mustaches. I saw him, said Mrs. Larch. I didn't like his manner. All sharp glances and no smiles. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had spent her morning in quieter observation. She had attended early service, sat 3 pews behind the Tattleberrys, and exchanged polite greetings with Major Weatherby and the organist. She drank her tea slowly on her back porch, listening as the village murmurs floated over hedgerows and gravel paths like pollen. She was not one to chase down gossip, but rather let it drift toward her, unaware it was being collected, categorized, and interpreted with the precision of a botanist cataloguing specimens. Just before noon, she received a visitor. Inspector Crail of the County Constabulary arrived in a Morris 8 saloon, his tweed jacket smelling faintly of tobacco and old upholstery. He was a man in his mid-40s with a competent air and a permanent furrow between his brows, as though every detail of life refused to align just so. Miss Marple, he greeted, removing his hat. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, she replied, gesturing to the chair beside her, with the sort of grace one associates with vicars' wives and aging duchesses. "You've come about poor Mrs. Blandford, I imagine." Crail sighed. "Yes, though I can't say there's much to come about. The doctor suspects poison, but nothing conclusive yet." She collapsed, alone in broad daylight, with half the village a stone's throw away. No witnesses, no weapon, no immediate suspects. "No obvious ones," Miss Marple murmured, folding her hands in her lap. He gave her a small smile, the kind worn by men who have learned to be polite when confronted with amateur detectives. "There was some item stolen, I understand?" she asked. He nodded. "The merchant's seal. Young Larch reported it missing, gone without a trace. If it was valuable, it might be a motive, but we're still looking into that." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the gentleman with the mustache?" Crail's brow lifted. "You saw him too, then?" "I did. Striking eyes. A traveler of some kind, I should think. He left the fete shortly after the body was discovered. No one stopped him, there was confusion, and no one had made the connection yet. We're trying to identify him now." She nodded again, as though ticking off items on a mental list. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the dead leave behind more questions than possessions." Crail gave her a long look. "If you happen to hear anything, Miss Marple." "Oh, I dare say I will," she said with a modest smile. "I usually do." That afternoon, 2 more rumors hatched, one that Honoria had kept a pistol in her bedroom drawer, and another that she'd sent a letter to London just days prior, no less. At the village shop, Mrs. Pettingill swore she had seen the maid, Clara, crying behind the coal scuttle that morning, though she couldn't say whether it was grief or something else entirely. Clara, when questioned by Crail, claimed to know nothing of her mistress's affairs, except that she'd been nervous in recent days and unusually interested in local church records. By sundown, it was widely agreed that Honoria Blandford had not come to Little Welford merely for peace and quiet. No, she had come for something else, something left unfinished, buried in the village's past like a bulb in cold earth, waiting to bloom in darkness. And as Miss Marple stood at her window, watching twilight melt across the rooftops, she thought of the seal, the strange symbol etched into brass, the way Honoria had gripped her reticule, and the unreadable tension in her features when the stranger had approached. Not everything buried in the river stayed forgotten. Some seals, once broken, could never be put back again. The morning after the fete was a subdued affair. Church bells rang with their usual Sunday melancholy, but even the crows in the churchyard seemed to call a little less sharply. Death, it appeared, had drawn a curtain over the village, muting its usual rustlings and gossip into something altogether quieter, though no less fervent. Inspector Crail returned to Little Welford that morning, accompanied by a younger constable named Finch, who seemed more preoccupied with his polished boots than the case. Together they called upon Clara, the maid, at the Grange. The Grange, for all its grandeur, seemed diminished in Honoria Blandford's absence. The ivy-clad exterior and leaded windows now suggested something brooding, its charm darkened like silver, left too long untended. The front parlour, once scented faintly of bergamot and lavender, carried now the flat, hollow smell of a house in mourning. Clara was pale and stiff in her black frock, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. She answered questions with trembling precision, careful to betray neither ignorance nor impropriety. She seemed preoccupied these past days, Clara said, eyes darting from Crail to Finch and back. She was expecting a guest, or perhaps dreading one. "Did she mention a name?" Crail asked. "No, sir. Only that he was not to be invited in." "Did he arrive?" Clara hesitated. "I saw a man approach the garden gate during the fete." She watched him from the drawing-room. Then she left quite suddenly. "I believe she went to the hedge by the rose tents, and then the girl trailed off." "And this guest," Crail said gently, "had you seen him before?" She shook her head. dark suit. Foreign-looking. Not from the village. Miss Marple, seated on a small bench not far from the Granger's gate, had watched the inspectors come and go. From her handbag, she withdrew a notebook used not for writing, but for pressing petals. A pressed sprig of lavender marked one page, though the inscription on the opposite one read simply, Calvetti, observed. She knew how to wait, and while she waited, the village rustled with theory. At the vicarage, Mrs. Tattlebury had taken over the tea rota and was engaged in vigorous speculation over scones. I knew something was amiss the moment she asked to see the church's donation ledgers. Who does that unless they're trying to sniff out someone's past? Perhaps she was charitable, the vicar offered meekly. Mrs. Tattlebury snorted. Charity rarely begins in the vestry. Elsewhere, in the back room of the post office, Miss Green, the postmistress, was rereading the ledger for registered mail. One entry, dated 3 days before the fete, featured a parcel from Honoria Blandford to a solicitor in Bristol. Odd, she murmured to herself. She never sent anything before, not even a Christmas card. By noon, Inspector Crail had received the coroner's preliminary report. Poisoning. Cyanide, to be specific. Rapid acting. Possibly administered in a drink or absorbed through the skin. No glass had been found, no vial, no scent of almonds, which would have made things easier. Crail paced the lane outside the fete grounds, watching a few stray petals drift on the breeze. He was a man who disliked vagueness. He preferred motives that were clean, actions that were sharp-edged. But this murdering murder unfolded like an onion, each layer revealing not answers, but more layers beneath. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to young Timothy Larch. The Larch family lived in a modest cottage on Birch Lane, its garden well-tended and cheerful, though the boy's mood did not match the flowers. He sat on the back step, clutching a battered notebook in which he had recorded every artifact displayed at the fete. Miss Marple sat beside him with the careful grace of someone who knew not to startle fragile things. "I always found history very comforting at your age," she said kindly. "It helps make sense of the present, don't you think?" Timothy sniffled. "It was my fault. I left the seal unattended." "Why did you leave?" she asked gently. "To fetch a lemonade for Miss Pettingill. She's old and has gout." I thought it'd only be a moment." Miss Marple nodded, eyes kind. "And you found it missing upon your return?" "Yes. The box was empty. But there was something odd." He hesitated. "Yes," she prompted. The seal was heavy, but the box was tipped over like someone snatched it in a hurry, and next to it was a handkerchief. Silk, with a stitched fishhook symbol, just like the seal. Miss Marple blinked slowly. "And where is that handkerchief now?" "I gave it to Constable Finch. He put it in a paper envelope." "Very wise." Miss Marple's thoughts stirred. Symbols embroidered on silk, old merchant insignias, a seal that vanished before its owner died mysteriously in public view. As she walked back toward the village, a thought struck her, not about the seal, but about Honoria. It was the faint look she had given Calvetti that day, not hatred, not fear, not entirely. It had been recognition tempered by calculation, a woman not surprised by danger but trying to time its arrival. In the post office, Miss Marple stopped briefly and inquired whether any of the registered mail entries could be viewed again. Miss Green hesitated, then fetched the ledger. There it was, Mrs. H. Blandford. To Mercer and Ray, solicitors, Bristol. Mercer and Ray, Miss Marple repeated aloud. Interesting. Miss Green leaned in. "Do you think they'll know who killed her?" "Oh," said Miss Marple with a soft smile. "I don't imagine they know yet. But they may know why. And once one knows why, the who tends to come along eventually like a bad penny." As dusk settled again over Little Welford, more pieces shifted into place. Small ones, forgotten ones. But in Miss Marple's mind, the puzzle was beginning to show edges. Not enough to see the whole picture, but enough to know that someone in the village was lying. It is a truth long known in Little Welford that once a mystery takes root, it blooms rapidly, often ahead of the flowers. Within 2 days of Honoria Blandford's death, 3 names had quietly risen to the surface of village conversation. Not shouted, mind you, but gently offered with an arched brow or a delicately lifted teacup. The first, unsurprisingly, was Clara the maid. She was the only one with daily access, said Mrs. Clifton to a knot of neighbors outside the baker's. Lived in the house, knew her habits, and grief, well, it's such a tricky thing. Can look very much like guilt from the wrong angle. A foreign woman dies, and you look to the help, snapped Mrs. Pettingill. Very tidy, isn't it? Well, muttered Mrs. Clifton, adjusting her scarf. Sometimes the tidy solution's the right one. Clara, for her part, had taken to staying indoors. The blinds at the Grange remained drawn, and though Inspector Crail had questioned her formally a second time, no damning inconsistencies had arisen in her answers. Still, the village could not shake the suspicion that she knew more than she was saying. Then there was Mr. Price. The schoolmaster had always been something of an enigma himself. Widowed young, fond of antiquities and silence, he lived alone in a narrow, book-filled house beside the village green. His fascination with the merchant's seal was well known. He had submitted it to the fête's display himself, having borrowed it from the Historical Society's collection for educational purposes. When the seal vanished and Honoria died scarcely an hour apart, fingers began pointing toward Mr. Price not out of malice, but because no one could quite rule him out. He was quite insistent about it being displayed, noted Mrs. Tattlebury in the tea-room. Droned on merchant routes and trade symbols and what have you. Too much interest in an old bit of brass, if you ask me. Wasn't it his idea to add the historical table this year? Asked Reverend Allen, puzzled. Exactly, said Mrs. Tattlebury with finality, as though that alone proved complicity. Inspector Crail, aware of the undercurrents, had asked Mr. Price to come in for an informal conversation at the village hall. Miss Marple, who just happened to be rearranging the flower vases on the window-sill nearby, overheard the exchange. "I can't imagine why you'd suspect me," said Mr. Price, his voice tight. "Yes, I arranged for the seal's display. I thought it would educate, inspire some sense of heritage in the children. And your relationship with Mrs. Blandford?" Crail asked mildly. "I barely knew her," Mr. Price replied, eyes narrowing. "We exchanged no more than polite greetings. She wasn't a member of the Historical Society, nor did she show any particular interest in our displays, though she did seem interested in the seal itself. She asked me about the symbol, said she'd seen it once before. That's all." Crail paused. "And you didn't think that curious?" "I thought it odd, yes, but not dangerous." Danger? That word hung in the air long after Mr. Price departed. But the most intriguing suspect of all, the one the village could neither explain nor fully name, was the stranger with the waxed mustache, Mr. Calvetti. By Tuesday morning, Crail had managed to track his name to a foreign passport entry at the seaport in Dover. Italian by origin, occasional traveller, known in some circles as a maritime antiques dealer. No fixed address in England, no confirmed link to Mrs. Blandford yet. Miss Marple, while not officially consulted, was quietly watching every move. She paid a second visit to young Timothy Larch that afternoon, bringing him a tin of barley sugar sweets and a question. "You mentioned the seal's weight," she said, seating herself beside him under the climbing clematis. Timothy nodded. "It was heavier than I expected. Would someone unfamiliar with it have known that?" "I suppose not." "Then someone familiar with its heft would have had an advantage, could remove it without drawing attention." Unless she paused. Unless it wasn't removed at all. Timothy blinked. "But it's gone." "Yes, said Miss Marple, but perhaps not stolen in the ordinary sense. Perhaps concealed. The boy frowned, intrigued. She tapped a finger to her chin. Tell me, who was the last person you remember near the table before you left? Timothy frowned, thinking. Mr. Price came by briefly. He was talking to Mr. Enderby about a missing label. Then I think I saw Clara bringing a cup of tea to Miss Pettingill, but she walked past our table. And oh, yes, that man, the one with the mustache. He looked at the seal. Just for a second, then walked off. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Thank you, dear. That helps quite a bit. That evening, Inspector Crail invited Miss Marple for tea more formally than before. I've been thinking about our mystery, he admitted, pouring her a cup. As have I, she said. 3 suspects, he said. Each is plausible. Clara for access, Mr. Price for motive, Calvetti for mystery. And yet none of them feel quite right, Miss Marple finished. Crail raised an eyebrow. Oh? They're too convenient, she said, taking a delicate sip. Too tidy, as someone recently said. Clara may have seen more than she let on, but she lacks the cunning for poison. Mr. Price is passionate about history, but not death, and Calvetti, well, he's involved, certainly, but not in the way we think. Crail leaned back, lips pursed. You believe we're missing something. I believe, she said. We're standing too close to the painting. We need to step back. As twilight sank once again over Little Welford, Miss Marple took a solitary walk through the fete grounds. The rose tents had been dismantled. The rhododendrons, undisturbed, stood where they had concealed a secret no one was meant to discover. She bent near a patch of disturbed earth just outside the hedge. A small indentation caught her eye, no larger than a coin, circular, pressed deeply as though something heavy had once rested there. She straightened, eyes glinting. The seal had been here, but had it ever left? Perhaps it was not the theft of the seal that had precipitated the murder, but what it symbolized. Something ancient, something buried. The seal had been a key, and someone had killed to keep the door it opened shut. Rain had swept into Little Welford during the night, washing the slate roofs clean and leaving the hedgerows beaded with droplets that sparkled faintly in the morning light. It was the sort of soft, persistent drizzle that encouraged quiet-thinking windows fogged with contemplation, kettle steam drifting beside the gentle clink of a teacup. Miss Marple, who always preferred a pot of Darjeeling when thinking seriously, sat in her drawing-room that morning, her blue porcelain cup untouched, her gaze turned to the lane beyond the lace curtains. Something had been tugging at the back of her mind since the fete. Not a glaring clue, nor a bold contradiction. Those were for dramatic novels and theatrical detectives. No, this was a matter of human nature. Something someone had said or not said. She fetched a small notebook from the writing desk, where she kept notes of flower species, village birthdays, and occasional remarks of interest. She flipped back 2 pages to where she had scribbled the name Mercer and Ray, Bristol, and drew a tidy underline beneath it. Rising with purpose, she pinned her brooch, tied her hat, and made for the post office. Miss Green, the postmistress, looked up from her sorting desk with mild surprise. "Oh, Miss Marple. Early for your usual," she said cheerfully. "Only a brief errand today," Miss Marple replied. "I would like to send a telegram to Bristol, to the firm of Mercer and Ray. They may be able to shed some light on a matter of historical interest." Miss Green fetched the necessary slip of paper. "Something to do with the fete?" "Indirectly," said Miss Marple with a small smile, "and I'd be very obliged if it could be sent promptly." That task complete, Miss Marple took the long way home, past the churchyard and the side gate of the Grange. Rain still pattered on her umbrella, but it did little to deter her. There was something about the Grange's side garden that tugged at her memory. Honoria Blandford had walked through it on the day of the fete hurriedly, according to Clara, and headed toward the rose tent, where she was later found. But what if that had not been her original destination? As Miss Marple peered through the black iron fence, she noticed something peculiar. Just past the gate, where the gravel turned to paving stones, one flat tile had been slightly dislodged, as if someone had stepped on it awkwardly or lifted it. She glanced around, then opened the gate quietly and knelt beside the tile. It shifted with some effort, revealing a shallow hollow beneath. Inside was a small pouch oilskin wrapped and sealed with an old-fashioned wax stamp, a fish-hook-like trident. Miss Marple did not open it immediately. She had, after all, seen enough mischief in the world to be wary of parcels sealed in secrecy. Instead, she took the pouch carefully and resealed the tile. Back in her sitting room, she opened the oilskin pouch on a silver tray lined with blotting paper. Inside were 3 items: a faded photograph, sepia-toned and cracked at the edges. It showed 2 young men in naval uniforms, one of whom bore a striking resemblance to the mysterious Mr. Calvetti. A small folded document stamped Confidential Ministry of Trade, and the 3rd letter, handwritten in dark ink, its script slanted and severe. "My dear Honoria, if you found this, then you must already suspect the seal's true origin. You must not trust Emilio. He knows only part of the truth, enough to chase it, but not enough to understand its cost. The Grange is not safe. Keep the seal hidden. Whatever lies beneath the riverbank must not be disturbed. Burn this after reading." Lady Miss Marple read the note twice, then carefully refolded it. Beneath the riverbank. She recalled the story of how the merchant's seal had been dredged from the mud years ago. Timothy Larch had mentioned Ite, a retired tinsmith, discovering it during a spring flood. The find had seemed curious then, but now, with Honoria's warning and the photograph, it began to feel intentional, deliberate. She wrapped the items once more and locked them in the drawer of her writing desk. That afternoon, Miss Marple made a discreet call to Inspector Crail. "I wouldn't trouble you unless I felt it was urgent," she said over the line, "but I do think you ought to pay a visit to the Historical Society archives. There may be more to the seal's story than meets the eye." Crail, already knee-deep in correspondence from Bristol confirming Honoria's engagement with a legal dispute regarding a colonial inheritance, agreed to meet her within the hour. They arrived at the Historical Society just as Mr. Price was preparing to lock up for the day. "Ah," he said, blinking nervously behind his spectacles. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting visitors." "Forgive the intrusion," Miss Marple said gently. "We're curious about the seal's provenance. I believe you kept a folder of notes when you submitted it to the fete." "Of course," he replied, stepping aside. "It's in the archives. Come in." They followed him through rows of dusty cabinets and into a cramped back room where he retrieved a leather-bound register. Flipping through, he found a page marked with a ribbon. "This is it," he said. "Recovered in 1939. Dredged up near the west bank of the Welford River. It belonged to a merchant ship called the Orlane, believed to have sunk in 1712. Crail frowned. "Sunk?" "Yes. Wreckage recovered years ago. Several artifacts turned up downstream." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Did anyone ever explore the riverbed formally?" "Not that I know of. The river floods most winters, too dangerous." "Then perhaps that is precisely what someone wished to keep undisturbed," she murmured. Mr. Price tilted his head. "I beg your pardon." She turned to Crail. "Honoria was afraid. She warned someone about Emilio Calvetti or stranger, and she feared something buried, something connected to that seal." Mr. Price paled visibly. "I didn't know she was involved with any of this," he said. "She only asked about the symbol. I assumed she had an antiquarian interest." Miss Marple watched him for a moment. There are few purely antiquarian interests that end in cyanide. As they left the Ici archives, Crail looked sideways at her. You found something today." "I found a message," she replied softly. "A warning written by someone named L. Possibly someone who died long before any of this began. And you believe Honoria was murdered to silence that warning?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that she got too close to a truth someone would rather have stayed buried. The seal, the photograph, the letter, they're not evidence of a theft. They're echoes of a much older crime." She paused. "And we've only just begun to hear them. There is a curious electricity that charges the air when secrets begin to rise like mist lifting from a moor. It cannot be seen directly, but one feels it in the nervous glances exchanged at the grocer's, the hush that falls when footsteps echo too closely, and the way tea is poured with exaggerated care, as though the slightest misstep might shatter a fragile equilibrium." By Wednesday morning, the villagers of Little Welford were behaving as if the weather had turned not meteorologically, but socially. The easy rhythm of country life had frayed. The garden club postponed its pruning walk. The church cancelled the Thursday knitting circle. And at the heart of it all remained two questions. Why had Honoria Blandford died, and what had the merchant's seal truly meant to her? Inspector Crail stood beside the Welford River that morning, coat collar turned up against the damp air. Miss Marple had sent him there with a quiet suggestion, and he had learned never to underestimate the value of such nudges. The river ran slow and brown, swollen slightly from the rain. On the western bank, the reeds whispered secrets to one another. He turned toward a patch of eroded shoreline. There, years ago, a tinsmith had discovered the brass seal, embedded in mud and muck, likely caught in the roots of a toppled elm. Crail knelt beside the edge and pressed a gloved finger into the clay. Miss Marple's words echoed in his mind. The seal was not the treasure, Inspector. It was a signpost. Later that afternoon, back in the village, Clara was seen in the greengrocer's, pale and fidgeting. Her hands trembled as she picked over carrots, discarding one after another. Mrs. Larch, noticing her distress, offered a smile and a kind word, but Clara barely responded. Miss Marple, having observed this from across the shop, waited until the girl stepped outside. She followed her gently, keeping a respectful distance until Clara paused near the war memorial. "I suppose you've come to ask me more questions," Clara said quietly, without turning. "No questions," Miss Marple replied. "Only to listen." Clara turned, eyes glistening. "They all think I did it, that I poisoned her, but I would never. I owed her everything." "Then tell me what you know," Miss Marple said, voice as soft as thread on linen. Clara took a long breath. "She was afraid, Miss Marple. Not all the time, but enough. A man had written to her. She showed me the letter, trembling. Said it was from someone called Emilio. She'd known him long ago before she came to England." "In what capacity?" "I think he was once more than a friend, but something happened. She wouldn't tell me the details. Only that he was after something she had. Not money, something to do with her family. Old documents, trade records, she said, from before the war." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did she ever mention a ship?" Clara nodded. "Yes. She said there was a vessel, sunken decades ago, carrying cargo someone wanted hidden. And the seal? She thought it was linked to the ship's manifest, like a marker key." Clara's voice broke. "I think she planned to send it away. That envelope, the one to the solicitors, he asked me to take it to the post, personally." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her sleeve. "You did very well, Clara, and I do believe you're telling the truth." At that very moment, another confrontation was taking place, this one less gentle. Mr. Price had been summoned to the police station for a second conversation. Not under arrest, of course, but the invitation had been firm enough to put him off his usual evening walk. Inside the small interview room, he sat straight backed across from Inspector Crail. "You borrowed the seal from the Historical Society, yes?" Crail asked, flipping through his notes. "Yes." "You logged it properly?" I did. There's a receipt in the register. You've seen it. Indeed. But something's still unclear. Did you know the seal's symbol matched anything other than merchant emblems? Mr. Price hesitated. I suspected it had connections to more ancient iconography. The fishhook pattern is sometimes associated with secret maritime guilds. Some even claim it signified contraband routes. Smuggling, in a sense. Did you share this with Mrs. Blandford? Number I didn't think it was relevant. Crail leaned forward. She was murdered, Mr. Price. Possibly for what that seal revealed. You didn't think that warranted a mention? The schoolmaster's mouth tightened. I never believed she was in danger. She barely expressed interest until the fate. Crail studied him for a moment. Do you know Emilio Calvetti? No, Price said firmly. Though I saw him. The man with the mustache. Yes. He came to the display, glanced at the seal, and said nothing. Crail closed his notebook. Thank you. That will be all for now. By evening, a fresh current of speculation pulsed through the village. It had reached the point where one could not pass the bakery without being greeted with a knowing look and a whispered theory. One particularly outlandish rumor had it that Honoria had once been married to a Portuguese pirate. At the Stag and Lark, Ned Hawkins suggested the seal was part of a buried treasure map. His friend, Will Fenner, scoffed. More likely a cipher, he said, draining his pint. Something about trade routes. There's always a cipher, isn't there? Miss Marple took her supper in peace, then made one final call to Reverend Allen. May I see the church's donation records? She asked, as gently as if requesting a hymnal. The Reverend, though perplexed, obliged. Together they flipped through ledgers dated 5 years back. A small note caught her eye, a donation made anonymously, marked only with a strange symbol in the margin, a fishhook trident. She smiled faintly. Thank you, Reverend. This helps more than you know. As she left the vicarage, the village bathed in a peach-colored twilight, Miss Marple felt the threads drawing tighter. The seal was no longer just a curiosity, it was a signature, a threat, a message. It had marked not only cargo, but secrets. Secrets someone had tried to bury. But the thing about Miss Marple was that she understood people. Not just their lies, but their motives, their impulses, their fear of being seen. And she was beginning to see very clearly indeed. By Thursday morning, the sun had returned to Little Welford as if nothing had ever been amiss. The clouds had lifted, the hedges sparkled with dew, and the village resumed its gentle bustle. But beneath the surface of civility, the atmosphere trembled with tension, like a cup of tea set too near the edge of a saucer. The murder of Honoria Blandford no longer felt like a singular event. It had started to unravel something older, stranger, and far more entangled than anyone in the village had anticipated. Miss Marple, for her part, spent the early hours in her parlor, arranging a modest bouquet of snapdragons and delphiniums. Her movements were unhurried, her mind anything but. She was waiting for something to tip the balance, and it arrived just before 11. Inspector Crail, looking unusually discomposed, appeared at her garden gate. I do hope this isn't a social call, Miss Marple said with mild amusement, ushering him in. No, Miss Marple. There's been another incident. She gestured to the tea service already laid. Then you'd best sit and tell me. Crail remained standing. Clara's gone missing. Miss Marple paused, mid-pour. Gone? Left the Grange sometime during the night. No note. No sign of struggle. But her bag and coat are missing. We've questioned the local station. She didn't board a train. Not that we've found. She simply disappeared. Miss Marple frowned. That doesn't sound like Clara. She's timid, but hardly impulsive. She may have feared arrest, Crail said grimly. Her disappearance doesn't help her position. Unless, said Miss Marple, someone wanted her gone. Crail exhaled. That thought crossed my mind. "And the seal?" she asked. "Any words? We've begun combing the river banks. Nothing yet." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me, Inspector, in your investigations, has anyone mentioned the name Leonora?" Crail looked puzzled. "Not to my knowledge." "Then I believe it's time we looked not at what Honoria knew, but whom she was protecting." That same afternoon, the village was stirred once more, this time by the discovery of a second letter. It was found not by the police, nor by Miss Marple, but by Timothy Larch, who had taken it upon himself to tidy up the Fates' leftover bunting, still hanging from the old pear tree. The letter had been wedged between the pages of a gardening journal, left beneath the raffle table. It was addressed to L., the same signature Miss Marple had seen in the oilskin pouch. Timothy, unsure what to do, brought it to the vicar, who in turn placed it in Miss Marple's hands. She read it twice in silence. "L, I've done what I can. The seal is no longer safe in the open. They are watching the river again. Emilio is closer than I feared. If you receive this, do not come for me. The Grange is no longer mine to defend. There's more hidden beneath the ledger." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "The ledger," she said aloud. Within the hour, she was at the Historical Society once again, standing before the great walnut cabinet where Mr. Price kept the old donation ledgers. He appeared from the back office, looking startled. "Miss Marple?" "Again?" "Yes, Mr. Price. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but I'd like another look at the donation records, particularly those from 5 years ago." He hesitated, then retrieved the volume and opened it for her. She turned to the same page she had seen before, the symbol in the margin, the anonymous donation. Then she ran her fingers gently beneath the glued-end paper. There, barely noticeable, was a slit in the lining. With careful fingers, she drew out a folded piece of parchment, old, crumbling and brittle. On it was a map, a simple sketch, but unmistakably local. The river bank, the elm tree, the west path, and marked with an X just behind the old stone wall that bordered the far edge of the Fete grounds. She looked up to find Mr. Price watches her with something more than curiosity. "You knew it was there," she said quietly. He said nothing. "You didn't put it there. But you knew." Mr. Price's shoulders sank. "I suspected. Honoria asked me to hide something once. I didn't ask questions. She said the fewer people who knew, the better. Did you know she feared for her life?" "No," he said after a pause. "I thought she was paranoid. Dramatic. I didn't realize she was right." Miss Marple gave him a long, thoughtful look. "Secrets," she said, "don't tend to age well, Mr. Price. They fester, they rot." That evening, as the sun slid behind the hills, Inspector Crail led a small excavation behind the Fete grounds. Beneath the mossy stones of the old boundary wall, they unearthed a locked tin box sealed with wax, bearing the same trident symbol. Inside were 3 items. A journal, worn and stained, its pages filled with ink sketches and trade entries dated 1711. A set of shipping manifests marked Orlane. And a final letter addressed not to Honoria, but to Leonora. Crail stood in silence as Miss Marple unfolded it. "Leonora, the truth is heavier than I imagined. I've hidden what I could. The Orlane did not simply carry spices. It carried names, debts owed, debts paid. Entire fortunes were built on its silence. Emilio must never find it. Your sister, Honoria." Miss Marple closed the letter with trembling fingers. "She wasn't Honoria," she whispered. "She was Leonora's sister. She came to protect her legacy and the village." Crail looked stunned. "Then who is Leonora?" Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. "That inspector is what we must find out next," and just as she said it, a small envelope fell from the tin box. No seal, no signature, but on the back, in looping feminine handwriting, were 5 words, Ask the widow at Rose Cottage. Miss Marple took one long breath, folded the envelope, and placed it gently in her handbag. She had a visit to make, and something told her that the past was about to surface. The path to Rose Cottage wound along a narrow lane fringed with cow parsley and foxgloves. It was a modest little home, tucked beneath an overgrown wisteria, with shutters the color of faded mint and a crooked chimney that always seemed to be leaning a little farther than it had the week before. Miss Marple walked slowly, umbrella in hand, though the rain had long passed. Her pace was not one of hesitation, but of precision. She had allowed the mystery to speak for 7 long days. Now it was her turn to ask the right questions and listen for the wrong answers. The widow at Rose Cottage was Mrs. Agatha Vernon, an old friend of the community, or so most believed. A woman of excellent standing, retired nurse, fond of seed cake and afternoon solitude. She had lived in Little Welford for 2 decades, long enough to appear as much a fixture of the village as the vicarage itself. But Miss Marple had known Agatha Vernon before she was a widow. She knocked gently. The door opened a crack. "Oh, Jane," Agatha said with a faint smile. "What a surprise. Do come in through the parlours, rather untidy." "I never mind a bit of untidiness," said Miss Marple, stepping inside. "It tends to reveal what order tries to hide." Agatha led her to the parlour, where faded chintz curtains filtered the afternoon light, and a pot of oversteeped tea sat cooling on the tray. The hearth was cold. A lace doily had slipped from the arm of a chair and lay on the floor. "You've had a visitor," Miss Marple said gently. Agatha's hand paused halfway to the teacups. "Number just the post. A strange postman, perhaps. One with a moustache and maritime tendencies." Agatha didn't answer. Miss Marple sat. "Leonora," she said softly. Silence. Then Agatha Vernon, Leonora Blandford, sat down across from her with a look that was not guilty but exhausted. "I never thought you'd find me," she said at last. "Oh, I didn't," Miss Marple replied. "You left breadcrumbs. Honoria left trails. The seal, the letters, the ledgers. But the name that I found in your kindness, your quiet disappearances, the way you avoided looking at the fete display." Leonora folded her hands. They were trembling. "Came to warn me," she whispered. "My sister. She took my name when she fled Portugal. I was already here, hidden after the war. She said the past had followed her, and Emilio Calvetti—" Leonora's lips thinned. "He was never a lover. He was a courier, for men who wanted the past to stay buried. The Orlane carried a cargo of secrets, blackmail, debts, ledgers of corruption. Honorary sisters stumbled upon a box of documents in Lisbon, remnants of our father's dealings. She traced them to the ship, to England, to me." "And the seal?" Miss Marple asked. "It marked the box containing the manifests. That seal was the key. Honoria brought it with her, thinking if she left it at the fete, in plain sight, it would flush Emilio out." Miss Marple nodded. She succeeded. Leonora closed her eyes. She tried to trap him, but she underestimated how desperate he was. He followed her. "And I didn't stop him." "You were there that day," Miss Marple said gently. "You watched from behind the rose hedge." Leonora nodded, barely. "I saw him slip something into her lemonade," she whispered. She never drank anything without first asking Clara to taste it, but that day Clara was away. I should have shouted. I should have stopped, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple waited, the silence as heavy as the truth. "I thought," Leonora continued, voice breaking, "that if I let it happen, it would end it all, that he'd flee, that the past would die with her." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm, but secrets never die politely. They dig themselves new graves. Leonora met her eyes. "Will you tell Crail?" "I already have," Miss Marple said. "But I told him there was one final step, one final test." Leonora looked puzzled. Miss Marple stood. I invited Mr. Calvetti to tea. The knock on the door came not 10 seconds later. Miss Marple opened it herself. Emilio Calvetti stood in the doorway, still in his dark grey suit, his waxed moustache as neatly sculpted as ever. He gave a slight bow. "Signora Marple." "Signora Vernam," he said smoothly. "I trust this is a social visit?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "you'll find it rather more of a reckoning." He stepped inside, his eyes flickering only briefly toward Leonora. "Tea?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. "No," said Calvetti. "I've come for the seal." "I believe," Miss Marple replied. "You already have it." He smiled. "I have nothing." "But you did," she continued, seating herself calmly. "You took it not from the fate, but from Honoria's belongings afterward. You used Clara's moment of distraction, perhaps even frightened her into fleeing. But you couldn't find the documents, could you?" Calvetti's expression soured. "You're clever, old woman." "No," said Miss Marple. "I'm simply observant, and I've spent my life understanding people like you, those who use silence as a weapon and fear as a lockpick." Inspector Crail entered through the kitchen door at that moment, flanked by 2 constables. Calvetti stood abruptly, but it was too late. "You'll find a sealed envelope in his coat pocket," Miss Marple said. "Marked with the trident. The final ledger. He took it from the Grange 3 nights ago after Clara fled." Crail retrieved the envelope and nodded grimly. "We've enough to charge him. International theft, blackmail, and now murder." As the constables led Calvetti away, Miss Marple turned back to Leonora. She looked older than she had just an hour ago. "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "we're not meant to carry the whole weight of a family's sins." Leonora said nothing. Outside, the village resumed its quiet rhythm. A cart rolled past, a sparrow sang in the hedge, and in the parlor of Rose Cottage, Miss Marple took up her teacup at last. There was still the matter of Clara's return, still the question of what to do with the remaining documents, but for now, the seal had been found, and the truth, though heavy, had been spoken aloud. The morning after Emilio Calvetti's arrest broke clear and crisp over Little Welford. The village stirred as usual, postmen whistling, hens clucking, kettles boiling, but something unspoken lingered in the air. It was not fear, nor even shock. It was something more curious. The silence that follows a storm, when every leaf seems aware of what has passed. At the vicarage, Mrs. Tattlebury took her tea with unusual restraint. "Well," she said, lips pursed, "one always suspected that woman brought trouble with her. Though I must say, poisoning at a garden fete is a new low even for this village." The vicar, bless him, said nothing, merely turned another page of his morning sermon. Meanwhile, at the Grange, Inspector Crail stood in the front room, speaking with Clara. The young maid had returned late the previous night, escorted by constables from a nearby farm where she had taken shelter after fleeing in a panic. Her nerves were still frayed, but she was composed enough to answer Crail's questions, and, importantly, she had been cleared of any involvement. "I didn't know what to do," she admitted, twisting her apron. "That man, Mr. Calvetti, cornered me in the corridor the night before the fete. Asked about a ledger, said he'd pay me to hand over anything Honoria had hidden." "And did you?" Crail asked. Clara shook her head, eyes wide. "No, sir. I never saw any ledger. But he scared me. Said bad things would happen if I said anything." "You did the right thing," Crail said. "And it's over now." Not far from the Grange, Miss Marple sat in the parlor of her own modest home, a slice of buttered tea cake on the plate beside her, and a modest group gathered before her. Inspector Crail, Reverend Allen, Mr. Price, and young Timothy Larch, whose mother had finally allowed him to miss school for something she called educational. "I thought," Miss Marple began softly, "that now the immediate danger has passed, it may be helpful to explain how everything fits together." Crail gestured for her to continue. He had come to admire, though not always understand, the way Miss Marple's quiet deductions formed like lacework, delicate, intricate, and perfectly strong. Honoria Blandford, Miss Marple said, was not who we believed her to be. Her real name was Leonora Blandford. She had taken her sister's identity Honoria many years earlier, after escaping Portugal, but the reasons for that were not criminal, they were protective. She nodded to Mr. Price. The merchant's seal, which you generously displayed at the fete, was not merely a historical curiosity. It marked a particular kind of cargune of secrets. The Orleans, the ship whose records were tied to the seal, had transported something much more volatile than spices or silver. Mr. Price, already pale, looked down. Blackmail documents, names. Miss Marple nodded. Ledgers containing debts, favors, crimes, an entire undercurrent of power hidden beneath legitimate trade. The seal was an emblem, yes, but also a key, a symbol that linked these secrets together, Leonora posing as Honoria had come to England to protect what was buried. And someone followed her. Calvetti, Crail said. Indeed. But Emilio was not working alone. He had benefactors who stood to lose fortunes and reputations if the ledgers became public. That's why he posed as a collector. That's why he pressured Clara, searched the Grange, and ultimately poisoned Honoria when she refused to yield. Then she knew she was in danger, Reverend Allen asked quietly. Oh yes, Miss Marple said. She was terrified, but she tried to trap him first by placing the seal in plain view at the fete. She knew Emilio would come for it. Why not go to the police? Young Timothy asked. Because, Miss Marple said gently, some crimes are too old, too buried in international waters and diplomatic immunity. She believed that by exposing Calvetti, she could stop the chain without unleashing the rest of the names. That's why she left the ledgers hidden beneath the church donation ledger and behind the fete grounds. She paused, watching her listeners absorb the truth. There was a moment, she continued, when Leonora, our widow at Rose Cottage, could have prevented the murder. She was there. She saw what Calvetti did. But she was afraid. Not for herself, but for the weight of the truth her family carried. She froze, and her sister paid the price. And the second letter? Crail asked. The one Timothy found? A final message, Miss Marple said, nodding to the boy with a kind smile. A breadcrumb, just as Honoria left others. She knew someone would find it. She trusted that not all eyes are blind. Timothy blushed. Mr. Price spoke next, voice low. And what becomes of the ledgers? Crail folded his arms. They'll be sent to the Foreign Office. There are names in them still alive, still powerful. But that's beyond our jurisdiction. And Miss Vernon, Reverend Allen asked. She will remain at Rose Cottage, Miss Marple said simply. She has suffered enough. She's not a criminal. She's a survivor. Crail hesitated. You're certain? Miss Marple looked up, eyes sharper than anyone expected. Sometimes, Inspector, justice is not about punishment. It's about understanding what people carry and choosing not to pass the weight on. They sat in silence for a moment, the soft ticking of the mantel clock filling the room like breath. Then finally, the vicar rose and smoothed his coat. You've done a great service to this village, Miss Marple, and I dare say to history. She smiled, modestly as ever. Oh, I only paid attention. One sees more than people imagine, when one is thought not to matter. As the others left, Crail lingered behind. You knew from the start, didn't you? He said, even before the poison. No, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. I only knew that something didn't sit right. A woman as composed as Honoria Blandford collapsing from heat stroke behind a hedge? No, Inspector, it was far too theatrical. He laughed quietly. And you never once doubted the seal was the center? I doubted everything, Inspector. That's why it worked. Crail tipped his hat. "Until next time, Miss Marple." "Let's hope," she replied, "that there won't be a next time." Outside, the air was warming. Children's laughter floated over garden walls, and the first bees of the season bumbled about the foxgloves. Inside her parlour, Miss Marple took up her needlework. A plain piece of white muslin. No pattern yet, only the promise of one. There was still one section of the story left, but for now, it could wait. After all, not every thread needs to be knotted in haste. It is in the nature of English villages to recover quickly from scandal. Not because the people are indifferent, on the contrary, they feel things very deeply, but because life, in its quiet routines, insists on continuing. The teapots must be filled. The laundry must be hung. The rose bushes must be pruned. By the following week, Little Welford had resumed its tranquil rhythm, though the air still carried a faint charge, as if the land itself remembered the recent tremors. The fete grounds were once again occupied by children running with hoops, watched by their mothers from benches with parasols tilted against the afternoon sun. The missing seal had been returned to the Historical Society, now secured under lock and key, and a new sign beside the display labeled it simply Merchant's Seal, circa 1700s. Provenance under historical review. Miss Marple was not mentioned in the little description plaque, nor did she expect to be. Fame, as she often said, was best left to novelists and criminals. At the village shop, Mrs. Tattlebury was back to discussing marrow chutney and whether Mrs. Pettingill had overwatered her geraniums. But beneath her words was a faint wistfulness, as if she rather missed the drama now that it had ended. "Of course, I always suspected there was more to that woman," she confided to the postmistress. "Still, one must admire a woman who can conceal a double identity and still find time to embroider." Miss Green gave a non-committal nod and passed her a tin of biscuits. At Rose Cottage, Leonora Vernon kept to herself. She tended her garden and declined most visitors. The vicar paid a call, as did Inspector Crayleach, with a kind word and a quiet understanding. There were no charges, no scandal, only the unspoken knowledge that she had once lived in the shadow of a lie and had helped, in the end, to expose a truth. As for Clara, she had been offered a new position this time in the home of an Oxford professor and his kindly wife. She left the village with a suitcase and a farewell wave, her face no longer pale with fear, but rosy with promise. Timothy Larch, ever inspired by the drama, began his own project. With the blessing of Mr. Price and the Historical Society, he was creating a miniature exhibition entitled Secrets of the Seal, complete with a hand-drawn map, a mock-up of the Orleans Manifest, and a small plaque that read, "Dedicated to Miss Jane Marple, who saw what no one else did." Miss Marple, when she heard of it, smiled politely and sent Timothy a note in her neatest handwriting. "The best mysteries, dear boy, are solved by listening closely and doubting politely." Inspector Crail, who had become something of a regular for tea, arrived one Thursday afternoon with a small parcel. "From Bristol," he said, handing it to Miss Marple. Inside was a note from the firm of Mercer and Ray. "Dear Miss Marple, following your inquiry and at the request of our late client, we enclose copies of the Orleans manifests and attached affidavits. We trust they will aid in resolving the matter of Mrs. Blandford's estate. Yours, respectfully, R. A. Mercer." Alongside the documents was a smaller, folded letter, written in a feminine hand. "Jane, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I hope it was quick. I've always admired your quiet cleverness. If anyone could make sense of this, it would be you. Forgive me for not coming sooner, for not telling you sooner. But some secrets cannot be spoken, only unearthed." Lady Miss Marple closed the letter slowly. Crail sat across from her, watching her carefully. "Are you all right?" "I am," she said. "Though I must confess, I am a little older than I was last week. You're also wiser than all of us." She chuckled. Not wiser, simply more familiar with the ways people stumble over their own hearts. They took their tea in silence after that, each lost in thought. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long amber shadows over the village, Miss Marple rose and wandered into her garden. The delphiniums were taller than they ought to be this early in the season, but she let them grow wild. She knelt near the hedge and pulled a single weed. "It's always the little things," she murmured. "The misplaced glance, the odd reaction. The flowers are out of season." She stood again, brushing the soil from her hands. From the lane beyond, she could hear laughter. Children again, skipping and singing. Life untroubled and resilient. Inside, her needlework awaited a new pattern now, more intricate and half-finished. She would return to it later. For now, the case of the merchant's seal was closed. The past had spoken. The present had settled. And in a village like Little Welford, that was as much justice as the world ever offered. Miss Marple turned back toward the house, her steps light, her mind clear. She had once said the quiet country was not so quiet after all, and how right she had been.